Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to recognize several recipients of the Medal of Honor, our nation's highest military decoration for valor. Please join us in welcoming Major General Patrick Brady, Specialist 5 Jim McLuhan, Lieutenant Colonel William Swenson, and Colonel Paris Davis. Please join us in recognizing Mr. Milt Callum, a World War II veteran, and his family. We are honored to have them with us today as we pay tribute to the service and sacrifice of the greatest generation and all those who have served our nation. Joining him today, we are privileged to welcome Secretary Doug Collins, Secretary Brooke Rollins, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Eric Smith, the Director of the Office of National Drug Control Policy, Sarah Carter, the Honorable Stephen Munoz, Homeland Security Advisor to the United States Coast Guard, Executive Director of Army Cemeteries, Karen Durham Angular, and Freedom 250 CEO, Keith Crouch. Please join us in recognizing Mr. Milt Callum, a World War II veteran, and his family. We are honored to have them with us today as we pay tribute to the service and sacrifice of the greatest generation and all those who have served our nation. Joining him today, we are privileged to welcome Secretary Doug Collins, Secretary Brooke Rollins, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Eric Smith, the Director of the Office of National Drug Control Policy, Sarah Carter, the Honorable Stephen Munoz, Homeland Security Advisor to the United States Coast Guard, Executive Director of Army Cemeteries, Karen Durham Angular, and Freedom 250 CEO, Keith Crouch. Please welcome to the stage the Honorable Doug Collins, Secretary of Veterans Affairs.
Good evening. Please be seated. And welcome to this Memorial Day Twilight celebration sponsored by Freedom 250. For those of us who have served, for those that are in attendance tonight who are Medal of Honor recipients, our World War II, as we remember not only Korea, Vietnam, the Cold War years, Desert Storm, into now GWOT and Epic Fury as we go forward. Have you just thought about it for a second where you're sitting? Think about it for just a moment on the grounds of our country's most sacred place. A time in when we have heard singing tonight, we've heard the band play. But I would challenge you that the silence is what rings loudest here at Arlington. I've been around the world in service, was in Iraq in 2008 and 2009. And there are certain songs and there are certain memories that will come to you, and many of you I think know what I'm talking about. When you hear a certain word, you hear a certain song, you hear a certain melody, and it takes you to a certain place. And tonight, as we honor those who gave the last full measure of devotion, as you are here tonight to honor those who have empty places at tables, empty places at family ball games, empty histories of brothers and sisters who were taken far too soon, who never got to complete or even begin the rest of the life that they had. But for me, there are 24 notes. There are 24 notes that for me, no matter where I am, immediately call me to remember that when you hear those 24 notes, someone has given their life. Someone is gone. The 24 notes of taps, which we will hear later tonight, are a reminder to this country every time a service member passes. It's when one passes in a war zone or when one comes home and many years later passes from the wounds that they may have received, both visible and invisible. 24 notes should be the stronghold of Memorial Day of our country. 24 notes sounding clearly, that 24 notes, every time we hear the 24 notes, reminds us that the freedom we have today to be here, the freedom that we have to go home at night, the freedom we have to worship, the freedom we have to speak freely in public, the freedom that we have to disagree with our government comes from those 24 notes. Do not ever pass by those 24 notes. For each note can take a memory, a life, a family member, a service that was rendered, a service that was kept. And when you hear it on a foreign soil, you see that and that stars and stripes waving gently. It's a reminder that we only have one chance to get it right when we honor those that have given so much to us. So tonight, as we sit in this wonderful sacred area with candles representing the brightness of those that went before, because I will tell you that death is what unfortunately we remember, but it is truly not death, it is life that keeps all the people coming back to remember what they did. They're not remembered simply because they died and 24 notes were tapped out. They were remembered because they lived a life that took the right hand up and said, I will serve. So tonight, may we look around to each other and be thankful for what we have. May we look up to the heavens and be thankful that men and women like these lived. And may we also remember that how we know of their love is through 24 notes. Let us pray to begin this evening. Eternal God, we are in awe of you. For when we do not have answers, we can turn to you. And even if it seems like silence, we know that you are there, because you give us the breath and the life that we have. You have given us examples of courage. You've given us examples of wisdom. You've given us examples of loyalty and faithfulness. You have given us a field of white monuments that remind us of the greatest of these. Your word has taught us that greater love hath no man than to lay down his life for others. And tonight, as we begin, I pray your blessing upon this place. Father, not because we have earned, but because you have allowed us to see what true sacrifice looks like. Because you have sacrificed for us. So tonight, as we remember, as we call back the stories, as we remember why Memorial Day really exists, it is the life of those that lived, that then gave the ultimate sacrifice. So tonight, I pray that each of us find our own 24 notes that you have placed deep within us to remember a country, an administration, our leaders, our president, our vice president, our cabinet, our military leaders, those that are deployed right now as we speak, for the freedom to do what we do right now. May you bind them, protect them, and bring them home safely. And for those that do not come home, I pray for families. I pray for our Gold Star families. I pray for the moms and the dads and the brothers and the sisters. That some remember stories, others remember the kindness. But eternal God, I pray that you will let us remember your love in all that we do. It is about life. You have given it to us. Now let us return it in remembrance of these that we serve.
Please welcome the moderator for our discussions, Master Sergeant Jason Beardsley, accompanied by Major General Patrick Grady, Colonel Kevin Root, and Dr. Mark Moyer.
So tonight, we're going to discuss the man, but it's not about how he died as much as it is about how he lived. And to do that, I thank you all for being here. Colonel Rue, Vietnam was a different place and a different war.
Yes.
Rocky was an Army graduate from the Ranger School and a West Point graduate.
Correct.
His life was an exemplary to others, but he was also a studied priest who got accepted to Maryknoll and was intent on going back to Vietnam as a Catholic priest. His care for the people of Vietnam, his mastery of the language, he spoke both French and Vietnamese, showed that there was a lot more to Rocky, depth to him, that others recognized in him. But for those who were classmates that served alongside Rocky during his time at West Point, or for those who went through Ranger training, what do we hear from them? You've spent years memorializing his life. What did they say of the man?
Rocky was a unique individual, that's for certain. His classmates, his company mates said that. Anyone who dealt with Rocky knew that he was an individual. He went his own path, but he was steadfast in all of his beliefs. He believed in the ideals of West Point, duty, honor, country. He was the son of a soldier. His father was a graduate of the Military Academy, class of 1933, and who participated in the Second World War. Rocky, born in 1937, as the oldest son in an Italian family, took charge even as a young man for his younger siblings, 2 younger brothers, and a third brother who came on after the Second World War, and a sister as well. Rocky, at an early age, took charge. That was one thing for certain. One thing about his being in Ranger School, he said later that he enjoyed it because when all his Ranger classmates were at their lowest point of lack of food and lack of sleep, he could tell them the way to go and follow him. That was one thing for certain.
I'm glad you mentioned his father. His service in World War II must have had an impact. To the degree you can tell us, explain what that was like for Rocky, walking in the footsteps of his father who served before him.
Certainly, as the son, the firstborn son in an Italian family, he wanted to follow in his father's footsteps. And he did what he had to do to earn a presidential appointment to the Military Academy at West Point.
So, Rocky comes to Vietnam, Dr. Moyer, 1962. It's early. He's early in the conflict as an advisor. And as a young man entering into the space that he was, what was Rocky's mission there? What was he doing in the Mekong Delta? And in what manner was he serving at that time?
Yes, well, Vietnam was the central front in the Cold War at this point, and it was already a hot war in the sense that people were getting killed, although there were not yet many Americans there. But Rocky was doing his duty, but he also believed in the mission, and this was not just any mission, but we were fighting against an ideology that would ultimately kill 100 million people. It opposed most of what America stood for. And so this was really the central struggle of his age. And at this point, the North Vietnamese had undertaken an invasion of the South, and American advisors had started coming in to help them deal with what was a very difficult challenge, because we had ceded Laos to the communists so that they could come in all sorts of places across their western border. So he was there in the southern part of Vietnam trying to help the South Vietnamese maintain their independence.
Okay. And Colonel Rue, in that early time, you spoke very passionately about the man Rocky was, bearing truth and always willing to step into the fray to sort of defend his ideas. But as he's an advisor there, can you explain kind of his personhood, who he was before he becomes a captured POW? What was his day-to-day like with the villagers?
As you said, Rocky was an advisor. He was an intelligent advisor to the provincial chief. Thus, he would go throughout the province, meeting with hamlet chiefs and village chiefs, and often stop by orphanages as well, because he'd get information from the local priests or nuns who might run that orphanages. And one thing that his mother said later on, that Rocky always carried candy with him. And when he visited orphanages, he gave the children candy, and they called him Dowey or Captain Candy.
Excellent. General Brady, you served alongside many of these POWs and other members of Vietnam. In that time frame before Rocky's capture, life for the American soldier, what did that look like, and particularly for Rocky?
In Vietnam?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I've been a member of the Medal of Honor Society for, I'm not going to tell you how long, because it would give away my age, but I've known Medal of Honor recipients from as far back as the Boxer Rebellion. And I've heard their stories, and I've written about them personally and professionally and everything, and the toughest of all of them were those who were POWs. The heroism that I heard about and have read about and talked to these POWs about, what they went through and those POW things compared to something a guy like me did in a few minutes of combat, not even close. So this guy, and I can tell you stories all night about the heroism that went on in those camps. In Vietnam, we had about 766 some POWs, and of those 115 or something died in prison. They didn't execute them except for one guy, and this was one guy they could not control. I was in the Delta, and in the Delta we had intelligence coming from villages and everything, and I'm a Catholic, and so I heard about this guy. They would parade him through the villages, as they did all of our POWs, and try to humiliate them. The people would beat them and throw stuff at them. But bits and pieces would come back to us about this one guy. Now, we tried rescue missions over and over again to go into places where our intelligence told us there were POWs. And we would get in there, and there would be cages, and there would be chains, and there would be warm food and all that, but no POWs. And they just had better intelligence than we did. But the conditions were just horrible. And I was on many of those rescue missions, and one particularly that has haunted me all my life, really. I was coming in on the deck, and in those days, everybody wore black pajamas. The guy in the black pajamas ran out in front of me, and I looked at him really quickly. He didn't have a gun, and when he turned, he was white. He was a Caucasian. And I stopped, turned around as quickly as I could, and came back. He was waving like this in front of my... Came back, and by the time I got back there, he was gone. And so over the years, there's no doubt in my mind that was, in fact, one of the POWs we were trying to rescue. But in all that time, we never got one out.
You told a story earlier when we were talking about the spirit of the men in the camps and seemingly how breakable that can be.
Yeah.
And some of the things that I think you were expressing that other camp prisoners did to revive faith or to buoy up the hearts of those men. Do you want to tell us a little bit about
that? This guy, they couldn't break him. I mean, they could not break him. And that's why he came to my attention. That fact, because the legend about how tough this guy was and what they tried to break him, because he was setting a bad example for the rest of the prisoners. And the communists couldn't deal with him because he was in their face, in their language, quoting the Geneva Convention and things that just puzzled them and pissed them off, as a matter of fact. And so finally, after a couple of years, they couldn't deal with him anymore, and they had to kill him. Now, the other stories that are of interest with these POWs, I mean, they have gone through so much and did not break. That's what impresses me so much about these guys, that to be completely helpless under somebody else, and to be tortured, and it's just horrible. Some of them, there's Jim Stockdale, the very famous one. He actually, and he was Ross Perot's running mate for vice president. He actually, when they wanted to parade him out in front of the cameras, he bashed his head in, so he was disfigured. They put a hat on him. So then he did his face. And then when that didn't work, he slashed his wrists. He tried to commit suicide rather than go out and betray his country. And that's an example of the kind of quality people, and that's why I think that our POWs were the greatest heroes ever.
Thank you. The irony of Rocky's capture is that he was 2 weeks away from the end of his tour. And as you mentioned, the voice of Rocky that echoed through the camps and that others have recalled hearing him singing, hearing him praying, and where the enemy intended to break him and turn Rocky into propaganda, he had the opposite effect with that voice. And Colonel Rue, as you've spent decades curating his memory, living with his friends and those who were in the camps with Rocky, what did it mean for them to hear that voice?
As Rocky's fellow prisoner of war, Nick Rowe, said, Rocky's stand against his communist indoctrinators and captors gave Nick Rowe and Sergeant First Class Dan Pitzer the will to survive. Every single day as a prisoner of war in the south of Vietnam was a daily struggle. The daily struggle to choose life or death. And Rocky chose life in his dealings with the Viet Cong, and that gave Nick Rowe and Dan Pitzer the will to survive. And Nick Rowe survived 62 months, more than 5 years in captivity, until he miraculously escaped from his Viet Cong captors. But Rocky sang, as you said, God Bless America at the top of his voice. In fact, Nick Rowe and Dan Pitzer, the last time they heard Rocky's voice was him singing God Bless America. He sang other patriotic songs to boost the morale of Nick Rowe and Dan Pitzer. And as I said, it gave them the will to survive.
That will to survive, that ability to shore up the spirits of men around you while in very difficult circumstances. General Brady, you're a combat pilot who's flown over 2,000 missions, and yourself a recipient of the award, the Congressional Medal of Honor. You must know a little bit about what it's like to lead men in those conditions. For Rocky, being a captive while also showing others the way to resist. What does it take?
The primary function of leadership is example. And we talk to a lot of young people, and they're all curious about leadership and how to be successful in life and those things. And this guy exemplified for me the thing that I call courage, the way I define courage. Fear is an emotion, courage is a decision. And for me, the fundamental basis of all courage is faith. There's nothing else I've been able to articulate to explain some of the things I've seen done in combat and the things I've known about and heard about these people who were in those camps. This was a man with incredible faith. And if you have faith, you will not experience fear. That's just a fact. And so this man, and that, as I said, that's what drew me to him, because I heard he wanted to be a monk. And then I heard he was singing God Bless America when they shot him. And, you got to admire something like that. That was probably one of the greatest death rattles in the history. But by example, and when a guy is down, and we were talking earlier about the POW that I met, he's retired as a major general, and what they would do to encourage people not to commit suicide who were in those camps. Because after a while, a guy gives up hope, he quits, he doesn't have faith, that God will help him and that America will come and rescue him, and so they actually talk about committing suicide. And he had to spend a lot of time persuading his people not to do that.
That's an important aspect that doesn't always get talked about, is the broken spirit and the ability to rebuild it in time. And Dr. Moyer, as you've written about these experiences, POWs in Vietnam and the different types of torture abuses that they went through, can you tell us today, for an audience that's been separated that for a while, what those men likely went through in captivity?
Yes, well, General Brady mentioned the Geneva Conventions, and the Vietnamese Communist government had signed the Geneva Convention, which prohibits torture, also requires that you provide basic housing, food, sanitation. The North Vietnamese completely ignored those provisions, and it had a couple motives. One was they were trying to get information of military value from the prisoners. They also wanted them to sign documents criticizing their own government. And for most Americans, this was anathema. They were only supposed to provide name, rank, serial number, and date of birth. But the North Vietnamese would then use all sorts of tortures and also other techniques depriving them of food, putting them in terrible living conditions. And a lot of them, people, after time, after months of this, most people are going to break to some extent, and so there was some degree of cooperation they might eventually elicit. But Rocky was, one of those who, despite the horrific, both physical and psychological torture that they used, was never willing to give in. And as you said, once it was clear that he could not be used, no matter what the price, he became expendable.
That knowledge, that understanding that prisoners went through, Colonel Rowe, as everybody's exemplified, the character of Rocky was such that he refused to submit.
He was a hardcore resistor.
Why was he such a hardcore resistor?
Because of his belief in the goodness and greatness of the United States of America. And knowing that, as General Brady said, his fellow soldiers were out there looking for him. He stood toe-to-toe with the Viet Cong interrogators. He debated them in English and French, as well as Vietnamese. And he told them at every occasion they were wrong.
He knew doing that would potentially jeopardize his life. So are you saying he was willing to take that risk?
Yes.
The other thing that I think is important is that our guys are just smarter than those guys. I mean, the guys in Vietnam and North Vietnam, they don't want to talk to each other. And some of them were put into solitary confinement for years. One person, one cell, nothing. But they developed a tap code so they could communicate with him. And then when they did interrogate him under threat, in one instance they said, did your pilots, I want you to say that your pilots refused to fly against us. And the guy says, yes, that's true, and I can give you the name of the pilots. Clark Kent and Dick Tracy.
A follow-up to your time as a pilot, flying combat and rescue missions, there's a sacredness to the mission to retrieve a fallen or the remains of those left behind, and you've flown those missions.
Yeah.
For Americans, this is a most sacred duty, and for someone in your seat, can you explain the weight of that mission? Why is it so important?
I think that, from the beginning of time, somewhere along the line with Caesar or one of those guys, they understood that if a soldier believed that he would be taken care of, he will fight better. It was a combat multiplier. And it was the same with the chaplain. If they had a chaplain there and if they had a doctor there, they would fight better. So it was something that was very important to combat readiness and everything. In my job, the one regret is that we were never able to rescue a POW. But we never left a wounded person in the field. And you would go for that person as if it was your wife, your son, your daughter. And it didn't matter how many helicopters it took you. It didn't matter how long it took you. You could not get up in the morning and look in the mirror if you left somebody out there in the field. And that's the way almost all of the dust-off pilots flew. And that's what I was a dust-off pilot.
The tragedy of Rocky's story is that his remains were never recovered. And we're here tonight sitting across from the tomb of the unknown soldier, where we honor the sacrifice of men who have fallen, women who have fallen in battle, that we may not have their remains left, but the mission is sacred.
Yeah, and you know, we were talking earlier, it's amazing, they're still over there. Our people are still over there. They're bribing villagers about crashes and different battles and everything, and they're actually out there sifting the dirt for bones to find and identify, and there's been some remarkable stories about people who they have found after so many years. They sift it, they bribe the villagers to show them where it happened, and then they send it to Hawaii, and they identify these people.
Well, for Rocky's story tonight, as a young man, 28, headed into one of the most daunting situations, and then to have been captured, tortured 2 years, his voice became a weapon. And in his last moments, as you've all mentioned, at the top of his lung, Rocky was singing "God Bless America."
Yes.
He didn't have a chance to return as he intended to care for the orphans in Vietnam. He didn't have a chance to fulfill his ultimate mission in faith and spread his beliefs, but he did it every moment he was alive. But for us to carry away those important things of Rocky's legacy, in a few moments, each of you, what was one thing you believe that people should know and take away when they think about Rocky Versailles? We'll start with you, Dr. Moyer.
Yeah, so I think it was his faith that helped bring him through, and he was certainly a man of Christian belief. He also, I think it's worth, given the theme of America 250, he believed in those fundamental American principles, which are also rooted in faith, and especially, above all, the notion that we're all created equal with natural and inalienable rights. So I think those were the truths that allowed him to persist, and truths that we need to remind ourselves of every day.
Thank you. Colonel Rue?
Simply stated, his faith in God, as well as the belief in the goodness and greatness of the United States of America. And Rocky's upbringing as a cadet at West Point, carrying on those values of duty, honor, and country.
I would just say that valor, courage, whatever, are interesting, but they're only useful in as much as they're inspirational. And they're only inspirational as much as they're able to transform the young people of this country into patriots. And stories like Rocky's and other great heroes, other great POWs that have been through that, should be a great inspiration to our young people to love this country and to serve and support this country. And if we don't do that, if we don't grow patriots, we have no future.
That voice of Rocky's as a young man entering into this. After 2 years of imprisonment, starvation, torture, Rocky was unable to be broken. In his Medal of Honor citation, it mentions that his faith in God and his will were indomitable. And because they couldn't break him, they had to kill him. And because Rocky went out classically as an American hero, his resistance met his final moment in him vocalizing and singing at the top of his lungs through the jungles that the other prisoners could hear, "God Bless America." And tonight, we're going to honor Rocky's voice and honor his faith. Thank you for helping us remember one of America's greatest heroes.
You're welcome.
Army's patriotic anthem, God Bless America, please welcome the United States Army Orchestra, the Joint Services Chorus, and Grammy Award-winning artist, Gretchen Wilson.
God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with the light from above, from the mountains to the prairies.
Please welcome back Master Sergeant Jason Beardsley, joined by Lieutenant Colonel Travis Taylor, and we are honored to be joined by the wife and youngest son of Captain Eggers, Rebecca and Billy Eggers.
Every headstone in Arlington tells a story, and it's a story of honor, valor, courage, devotion. But there are families behind those who are forever changed and who have given the ultimate sacrifice. Tonight, we also want to honor Captain Daniel Eggers, a Green Beret who gave his life serving our nation in Afghanistan in 2004. He's buried here at Arlington National Cemetery. The conversation, though, tonight, much like with Rocky Versace, is not so much about how Daniel died, but it's about the man he was and how he lived and how his legacy lives on. It's continued through the loved ones, and we're so thankful for having you here tonight. Rebecca Eggers, Billy Eggers, his son, and Lieutenant Colonel Travis, thank you for being here. So please welcome Rebecca Eggers, Billy, and Lieutenant Colonel Taylor. Rebecca, it's been a pleasure getting to know you and speaking with you. You have carried a lot of vitality, and as an Army Major, retired Lieutenant Colonel, I think yourself, you helped carry his story, Daniel's, along for years, but before this, you got to know Daniel before he was who he became. Tell us how you met.
So Dan and I were in our college ROTC programs. He was at the Citadel. I was at a college in Rhode Island, Bryant College at the time. And so in your ROTC programs, after your junior year of college, you have to go, at the time it was Fort Bragg for us, for leader training. It's a 6-week program. Typically the people who go at the beginning are your high-speed, low-drag people. I was not one of those people, but Dan was. I just wanted to get my summer started and go to work because I needed some money. But what ended up happening is we met. I got there a day late, and Dan was my squad leader. So I show up, and I've got all my gear. I'm in my civilian clothes. Everybody else is in their uniform. And immediately he's like, "My name's Dan Eggers. I'm your squad leader. Can I help you carry anything?" And I'm like, "Look, just show me where I gotta go." But I think that kind of set the tone for how we met. He was just willing to help you with anything, and he was just really passionate about what he did. So, I mean, right from the get-go, I was like, man, who is this guy? All in my face, right from the start, but it was who he was. And so, yeah, Fort Bragg, before we even got into the Army, is where we met.
You came to know him over the course of your lives together, and you know the people who also impacted him most. Can you talk a little bit about his father and his family and how they were part of who Daniel is?
I think anybody who ever met Dan could see right away that he was a bit of a natural leader. And I don't think that comes from anybody but an upbringing where you are. He was the oldest child of 7. A natural leader, but his dad was a Vietnam veteran, is a Vietnam veteran, and then is a retired police officer. And I think all of that instilled this kind of mentality of, I want to join the Army. I want to do good things. I want to be a good person. I want to help society. And I think he held that with him, and it shaped him. He was a young Marine in high school. I mean, he did all the Army things. Was a battalion commander in his JROTC. It was just who he was. I think anybody who met him knew that he was all Army all the time. And it was endearing, quite frankly, that he was that dedicated to the Army.
Billy, you were young, so a lot of your memories from your dad are shaped by the stories in your family, shaped by your grandfather, perhaps teammates of Dan's. As you grew up with that legacy, what are the stories that connect to you that you feel most represent the piece of Danny that you understood or you knew?
Well, I think that he had a lot of humor and he was able to connect with people, and I think that's why he was a great leader. And when he went out on missions, he used to listen to Black Betty. That's a good memory I have of him. But I definitely think his ability to laugh things off and and connect with people is why people respected him and could work with him.
That's an important thing, and in Special Forces, being able to connect with people and steadfast leadership that I've read a lot about. Captain Eggers means an incredible amount, and Lieutenant Colonel Taylor, you as a Special Forces captain yourself know what it's like to step into an ODA, a detachment filled with senior enlisted who are ready to chew you up, right? Tell us a little bit, for those who may not understand that dynamic, what it might have been like for Captain Eggers to step into his first team.
Now, I can tell you from personal experience, and I'm sure Dan had the same experience. It's very intimidating that first day you step into the team room. You know, you enter after years of working hard to get through the qualification course, to earn your Green Beret, and to finally serve on a detachment, while also having spent up to 4 or 5 years already cutting your teeth in the Army. And then you step into that team room, and you're a man among giants, especially for Dan at that time, that early 2000 period. Those NCOs, combat tested, combat proven, fully experienced. It's a very intimidating thing to walk in under the auspices that you are somehow going to lead them. You're the new guy. Everybody's been there before, whether you were a freshman in high school or freshman in college, or you just got to a new team or a new job. You're the new guy, and you know, I know from hearing the stories about how he carried himself that he likely walked into that room feeling very energized and excited, and it was contagious. And he was able to build that relationship through his interpersonal skills and personality in general that was able to earn that trust, that faith, that confidence in those combat-tested NCOs, especially in preparation to go to combat themselves and lead effectively. And be a trusted member of the team while also being able to lead effectively.
And Billy, I think you mentioned to me there was something important to you.
Ultimately, the mission can be achieved, and that's for anything.
Rebecca, when you and Daniel married, it was early in his training, and you both came through some grueling training, and then he went on to continue that in Special Forces. What was that like in the early years, and what was Daniel like inside that family you were building?
Yeah, so I said he was all Army all the time, and that was no lie. So he really just became whoever he was with. So I used to love hearing his team guys talk about when he was deployed. You know, he was language trained in Arabic, but when he deployed to Afghanistan, he learned Pashto when he was there. And his team guys used to tell us that when they didn't see Dan around, they knew exactly where to find him because he was with the locals. He would take naps with them. He would eat with them, have all his meals with them. But that's who he was. Like, he wanted that full experience, but that's how he connected with people. It was difficult. You know, it was when we first got married. We went to Fort Stewart, and then he went through his training. And he was gone 6 months, and they were back. But when they were back, they weren't really back. They were training for the next mission, and so he went again 6 months later. Nothing happens without a tribe of people helping. I didn't, you know, I had people to help me with the boys. I had a network that I really leaned on when he was gone because you just can't do it alone. And I think the family readiness groups are critical to that, and his unit spouses were critical to that. And even the people in my own units, because I was in the Army as well, you just lean on them. You become a family. They become your family when you don't have family around.
Your husband, as you said, served as part of this team, this tribe. Other members fell the day with Danny. Do you care to talk about some of the other team members that Daniel was with?
Absolutely. So when Danny was killed, there were 3 other soldiers with him. And I think it's important to say their names. Whenever we honor Dan, they're like a package deal, almost. We've become family. Tanya Mogensen, her husband was Sergeant First Class Rob Mogensen. Betsy Jeffries is a dear friend of mine. Her husband was Specialist Joe Jeffries. And then Petty Officer 1 Brian Ouellette was the Navy SEAL that was killed with them. It's important that we continue to remember them because their legacy and their family and how they carry on the tradition is as important as Dan's was. And so they have become our family, and we've made a pact that, you know, it's when we talk about one, we talk about all of them together.
What do you want people to hear or know, Rebecca, about what that means to you when you hear that moment, that the feeling that overwhelms you, that you carry things that not everybody has experienced? What did this mean for you?
I think it's a special thing. I don't know if special is the right word. It's a deeply meaningful thing to see someone and have a connection with someone and instantly know that they know what you're going through without a word spoken. That network has helped me through 22 years, and I think that's all that you can do is lean on your network, and hope that it's enough, and you do enough to keep your spouse's legacy or your family member's legacy alive. And it's not easy. For 22 years, I want to talk about him. I want to talk about him to a lot of people. I want to make sure that I'm talking to the boys, telling them stories. But it's difficult to manage over the years. And then sometimes you just think maybe it's too much. And then you get invited to do a program like this where you get to share his story again. And you realize that, you know what, when you talk about them and you share their legacy and what they're about and you talk about them with your kids, that is their legacy. Everything that they've done is still alive. That's how you keep their legacy alive.
Lieutenant Colonel Taylor, Special Forces training is a rarity. Less than 1% in the Army go through it. What was that like? What does it take to become a Special Forces commander the way Daniel Eggers did?
Well, it's kind of a complex question to answer. I think it takes a very unique individual in and of itself that would want to pursue this line of work. Many of us did, whether it's months or years of preparation leading up to the opportunity to go to Special Forces Assessment and Selection. For the officers, it takes a couple of years till you get to that window where you can even apply to get a chance to go to selection. So you've got to prove yourself in the General Purpose Forces as a platoon leader, as a company XO, as a company commander at times. And then you have to submit an application, and then they're going to evaluate and assess your merits up to that point to determine if you have the propensity to be successful just at selection. And then you get to go to selection, right? And selection is 3 weeks of very intense training, but less training and more of an assessment of who you are as an individual, as well as on a team or in a small team. You're going to be tested physically, mentally. They're going to test your resiliency. You have to have a lot of grit and determination to operate in an environment that is ambiguous, make very little guidance, and trust in your own abilities to achieve whatever the goal is or whatever the mission is. And that's just to see if you have what it may take for you to be successful in the Q course, the Special Forces Qualification course. And so for officers, the route is very similar to the NCOs as well, where you get that specialized training in all the Special Forces missions, unconventional warfare, special reconnaissance, foreign internal defense. You go through a lot of the same cycles of training for small unit tactics and language, but then you've got a unique military occupational specialty as an 18 Alpha, where you're going to get kind of a master's level course in planning a lot of these operations and kind of learning what your role is. It can be pretty demanding from an academic perspective inside of this grueling physical course that is truly going to test your academic acumen on attention to detail, time management, and how best to plan for a successful mission as best you can before you receive first contact, and most plans kind of go out the window. But that level of flexibility that they assess for allows you to go into that environment and be able to lead seasoned NCOs to accomplish any multitude of missions that you're going to be placed with based off of the dynamics of the world. More often than not, finding yourself in a location where it's austere, where you're working with the locals and you have to build that relationship and do that from a tactical formation while having strategic impacts. It's a very unique tool in the kit bag of the Department of War, one that I'm very proud to share the same path as Dan and to be able to wear the same distinguished headgear as him and yourself.
Amazing.
By the way.
Thank you. Rebecca. We know a lot from Danny's teammates, what a great leader he was, how steadfast, but in his real life back home, you described him as something of a full of vigor, comedic, faith-based man. What's the picture you want tonight's audience to hear about Danny with his boys, with you, his humor?
Yeah, I think anybody that knew him would know that he had quite a sense of humor. But also, you said faith-based. So Danny's love of God and country and family, those centered him. Those were at the core of everything that he did. And then everything, the sense of humor. He used to take the boys out. I mean, I would come home from work sometimes, and when JJ was young, I'd see JJ in just his diaper. He'd just be out of the bathtub with a mohawk, and they'd be, dancing around the house to Kid Rock. He was all of those things. Just a really good dad, a really good husband. But he was grounded in his family and God, and those kept him centered. So his no lack of confidence for sure, but also very determined, very dedicated to whatever he put his mind to.
Wonderful. Billy, when we talked the other day, you had a comment that really stuck with me, and I haven't really been able to get it out of my head since then. And being a service member and knowing that you may go into harmful situations and not make it, we're willing to lay ourselves into a bet, a sort of a moral bet that we may not make it. But what you told me was the other side of that bet, and what it was like as a young man, a young kid growing up, having to grapple with those feelings. Can you talk about that and what was hard about that for you?
Yeah, I think growing up it was hard to understand, why did he put himself in harm's way why did he put himself in harm's way and so that he wasn't home for me and my brother? But over the years, I realized that he cared more than just about his family. He cared about everyone in this country. He cared about the locals in Afghanistan. It was more than just his family. He stood for the whole country. And that took me 20 years to realize. Growing up, I just always thought, you know, he just wanted to be this cool soldier and go out and get the bad guys, but from what I understand, he stood for all of the American people, and he had a very worldly view.
We talked a little bit about how you followed into some of those traditions, and one that I think is a really heartfelt tradition is done at the Citadel. Do you want to talk about that and the ring that you bear?
Yeah, so my dad's ring was cut in half, and half was melted down into my brother's class ring, and half was melted down into my class. So each one of my class members carries the spirit of my dad as well as my brother, and it's such an honor. All of my classmates respect my dad's service, as well as my brother's classmates, so it's definitely an honor for that program to be established. I'm very grateful for it.
If he was here today and you could ask him one thing and tell him one thing, what would you ask?
I mean, I'd probably ask him a million things, but I guess the main thing I would ask him is, how can I better serve the community, whether that's through military service or just acts of kindness or creating a nonprofit. What should I do? That's what I would ask him, and I honestly don't know the answer. He could tell me 1 million things. He could tell me to figure it out for myself, but all I can do is strive to try to achieve those goals with my mom and my family's guidance.
Rebecca. What would you want to offer people who never had an opportunity to get to know Daniel tonight on this somber occasion?
I think it's not necessarily so much about Dan today. It's about, you know, what he stood for. You know, the legacy that he leaves behind. I think, you know, I talk about the pin, and there's lives behind those pins, and it's important for people to understand, like, their stories. I think this is the perfect opportunity for people to get to know Dan a little, like how we knew him. But I think at the end of the day, I would love people to just continue to ask Gold Star family members about their heroes, because it's the way that we continue to remember them. I think it's actually very therapeutic for family members to just talk about their loved one with people that maybe don't know. So I think I would just encourage people to just ask. Just ask when you see that pin, ask who their hero is. And that's how we keep their spirit alive.
Amazing. Lieutenant Colonel Taylor, for younger audience members who may someday aspire to walk in the footsteps of someone like Captain Eggers, what does it take? What's the spirit? What's the drive? How does someone go from the dream to making it a reality? And what do they need to know about sacrifice?
Well, you know, at the base principle is, you know, try, right? You miss all your shots that you don't take, right? And so, you know, if you have it in you to want to serve, I encourage, you know, at the Citadel especially, training young cadets on how to be future leaders, you know, is to find something that they aspire to be and to do it well, to be that good servant leader. You know, this path that Dan took before me and the one that I chose to walk, as much as yourself, is not an easy path. And we have a small saying at the Citadel, and I know Billy can relate, where you choose the path less traveled. Seek out that next hard challenge. Continue to test yourself. Don't rest on your laurels. You know, I have a little mantra that I say to some of my cadets that, you know, sometimes comfort or complacency is a slow death. Prefer the pain of hard work and what you can achieve by, you know, putting forth that effort to not only better yourself, but to better those that are around you. And for those of us that, you know, that wear the uniform, I think many can attest, you know, we don't do it for ourselves. You know, we do it for those to our left and our right and those that are behind us, with a vision of the future that we have in order to continue to protect and defend our way of life here. And swearing that oath, raising your right hand and wearing your country's uniform, there's a, you know, no more honorable way to serve and to have an impact in this world.
Thank you for that, Billy. Thank you tonight, Rebecca, Lieutenant Colonel Taylor. Thank you all for sharing your stories with us tonight, and thank you all for sharing with us this moment in time. I believe you have a prayer for us.
Is that right? Okay.
Please welcome back to the stage Secretary Doug Collins.
You see what I mean about the power of a story? I think tonight we can all come to the conclusion again that it is life that gives us stories. Memorial Day honors those stories. Would you please give another round of applause for both the storyteller panels tonight? Over my career, some know, some do not. I was a chaplain in the Air Force, recently retired just about a week and a half ago. But I also pastored. And doing funerals is something that is difficult, no matter how you might have expected or not. And one of the things that I used to say, and I still do occasionally at funerals, that I would say this, that each of us are like a piece of chalk, and wherever we go, we leave a mark. Memorial Day probably symbolizes that more than any, because for some of you here tonight, you have those remembrances of those that we lost, that did not come home, that died in service to this country. But opposed to having a piece of chalk not go anymore, that chalk is now you. That piece of chalk is now you making a mark wherever you go. So as we started the night with 24 notes, now the notes are with you. And in just a few moments, as those notes are played again, my challenge for you is, what will your note play? You may not have had someone that was lost in battle, but each of us in this country owe a debt of gratitude to those that did. Now the challenge for all of us is to use the notes that we have to each time remember what we have been given by their great sacrifice. As we close tonight, may the God who gives grace and mercy, who gives you more abundantly and amazingly more than you could ever think or imagine, may he give peace to our country. May he give life to those that live. May he give remembrance to those that have passed. And may he take each of us and hold us gently in his hands as we go forth to live the life that he has given to us. May God bless each one. Now, could we welcome to the podium Lieutenant Colonel Taylor as he recites the Citadel Prayer.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor to recite the Citadel Cadet Prayer in honor of Captain Daniel Eggers, Citadel Class of 1997. Almighty God, the source of light and strength, we implore thy blessing on this, our beloved institution, that it may continue true to its high purposes. Guide and strengthen those upon whom rests the authority of government. Enlighten with wisdom those who teach and those who learn. And grant to all of us that through sound learning and firm leadership, we may prove ourselves worthy citizens of our country, devoted to truth, given to unselfless service, loyal to every obligation of life, and above all to thee. Preserve us faithful to the ideals of the Citadel, sincere in fellowship, unswerving in duty, finding joy and purity and confidence through a steadfast faith. Grant to each one of us, in his or her own life, a humble heart, a steadfast purpose, and a joyful hope, with a readiness to endure hardship and suffer if need be, that truth may prevail among us, and that thy will may be done on earth. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll now ask you to please rise for the playing of taps and a moment of silence.
Thank you. As we conclude this evening of reflection and remembrance, please welcome back Gretchen Wilson and the Joint Services Chorus to perform Battle Hymn of the Republic, written by Julia Ward Howe. Thank you. As we conclude this evening of reflection and remembrance, please welcome back Gretchen Wilson and the Joint Services Chorus to perform Battle Hymn of the Republic, written by Julia Ward Howe. Thank you.
Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He has loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on.
Died to make men whole.
Stories of Service program. God bless our service members, their families, the President, and the United States of America. Thank you for coming, and good night.